the mind-body dichotomy. What relevance does that have to assertions that Ayn Rand's philosophy, objectivism, is internally broken or logically inconsistent, specifically with reference to the issue of anarchism? The basic anarchist argument runs something like this. They start with Rand's assertion that the government has a monopoly on the retaliatory use of force, and then they go on to say that, well, a monopoly has to be enforced using force. And so the anarchists say, well, let's say that a group of people want to pay another group of people for protection. In other words, they want to have a private police force. Why should that police force be prohibited from operating? Why should that contract be one that cannot be engaged in? Why should the state prevent all of that from happening? Why should the state have a monopoly on policing? At its root, that argument is an instance of the mind-body dichotomy. The body, action. The mind, thought. And so it's a thought-action dichotomy, if you want to put it that way. The anarchists read Ayn Rand's statement that government has a monopoly on the retaliatory use of force, and they see police. They think police. And their arguments all relate to policing. Read them. They all have to do with private police forces, security forces, etc. Well, let's deal with some of the minor and non-essential arguments first. Consider that Rand was living in a day when there were private police firms all over the place, and she had not one complaint about it. In other words, there were security firms, security guards, many bearing arms, protecting property. She had no, objections to security guards and that sort of thing, even though they were armed, even though they were protecting property. She wasn't talking about defense of property. She wasn't talking about defense of persons. Look at the word retaliatory. Retail. The root word has to do with counting. Retaliatory has to do with tallies. Someone has caused you to incur a loss. Retaliating is causing him to incur a loss. Account for account. An amount for an amount. An eye for an eye. In short, justice. Retaliation is about making sure that justice prevails. That one person does not impose a disvalue on someone else without that person suffering a disvalue himself. So we're not talking about defense. As another example, and in connection again with this idea that the government has a monopoly on the retaliatory use of force, Rand was specifically asked in that context whether she was in favor of gun control, banning the personal use and operation of guns.
Do you favor any form of gun control laws?
I have given it no thought at all, and offhand, I would say no, the government shouldn't control guns except in very marginal forms. I don't think it's very important because I don't think it's in physical terms that the decisions and the fate of this country will be determined. If this country falls apart altogether, if the government collapses bankrupt, your having a handgun in your pocket isn't going to save your life. What you would need is ideas and other people who share those ideas and the fighting towards a proper civilized government.
As Ayn Rand saw it, you don't, create freedom by bearing guns. That's not the recipe for freedom. But she didn't say that, well, bearing guns is opposed to freedom or that it's antithetical to freedom. That defending yourself is somehow wrong. She would never say that.
Who was it that saved my life? Somebody grabbed me as I fell and fired at the thugs. Did he? Straight at their faces. Blew their heads off. That was that new furnace foreman of ours. He's the one who got wise to what the Gravy Boys were planning and warned me this afternoon. Told me to arm our men, as many as we could. We got no help from the police or the state troopers. They dodged all over the place with the fanciest delays and excuses I ever heard of. It was that furnace foreman who organized our defense, ran the whole battle and stood on a roof, picking off the scum that came too close to the gate. Boy, what a marksman! I shudder to think how many of our lives he saved tonight. Those bastards were out for blood, Mr. Reardon. I'd like to see him. Send him in. The door opened. The man standing on the threshold, with disheveled hair, a soot-streaked face, and furnace-smudged arms, dressed in scorched overalls and blood-stained shirt, standing as if he wore a cape waving behind him in the wind, was a moral heroic man. Ayn Rand, Atlas Shrugged, pages 997 to 998.
Defense is different from retaliation. Defense means preventing someone from violating your life, your liberty, your property. Retaliation means after they've already violated your life, your liberty, or your property, something is done to the violator to ensure that justice prevails. The problem with retaliatory measures is that they have to be imposed only after a rigorous investigation of the facts, a consideration of the evidence supporting the facts, a rational consideration of that evidence, and the drawing of a conclusion, usually on a basis of, beyond a reasonable doubt, that a certain crime was committed, that a wrong was committed, that an injustice has occurred, that someone has been dealt a disvalue, and the person having done the dealing has not in return suffered a disvalue. The legal system is there to ensure that they do. That they spend some time in a cell if they do a wrong to somebody, or that they pay a fine. So retaliation is different from defense. Ayn Rand was not advocating a society in which everyone's disarmed, in which nobody defends themselves when they're attacked. Nonsense. She was simply saying that retaliatory justice, bringing people to justice after they've done wrong, that's something over which the government has a monopoly. And it has to be done that way so that the judgment of each person, so that the evaluation of the evidence, the consideration of facts, a consideration of the law that applies to the facts, so that it's all done objectively, that it's not driven by the passions of the victim. Ayn Rand was talking about ensuring that justice prevails in situations where an injustice has occurred. And she didn't want lynch mobs going around, posses looking for people who they thought did some kind of crime and just lynching them, possibly without a trial, but certainly without a fair one, certainly without an objective one, and certainly not necessarily guided by the law, by any objective law. Now, let's go back to this mind-body dichotomy, which I think is the essential argument. The anarchists say, well, the government has to impose a monopoly on force, and therefore they don't want any private police forces. They're trying to keep that for themselves, and it would be unjust to impose that coercive physical force to prevent competition from arising in there. And therefore it would be wrong for Rand to say that the government has a monopoly on the retaliatory use of force. Here's where the mind-body dichotomy comes in that argument. Anarchists are consistently talking about police forces, competition among private police forces, or even having competition among judiciaries, private arbitration and that kind of thing. But at the root of all of these things is the law. The law. Not the legal systems, but the legal system. You can't have competing laws. And the laws are the equivalent of the thought behind the force that is used by the state. So at the root of all police action, at the root of all judicial activity, is a set of laws. And that set of laws is effectively the code of ethics that's being applied by the state. It's one code of ethics. In a free country, that system of laws is based in reality. It's rational, and it serves the purpose of protecting every person's life, liberty, and property from non-consensual conduct. so that no person is deprived of their life, liberty, or property, except with their own consent. That's the purpose of the law in a free country. The bottom line here is that the law is effectively the mind that guides the actions of the police, of the judiciary, of the jailer, the warden. The law is the mind, and the law is what the government has a monopoly over. And it has to, or else there wouldn't be a government. There would be multiple governments. There would be multiple systems of law. And it would be impossible for anybody to obey one set of laws without violating another set of laws.
The retaliatory use of force requires objective rules of evidence to establish that a crime has been committed and to prove who committed it, as well as objective rules to define punishments and enforcement procedures. Men who attempt to prosecute crimes without such rules are a lynch mob. If a society left the retaliatory use of force in the hands of individual citizens, it would degenerate into mob rule, lynch law, and an endless series of bloody private feuds or vendettas. If physical force is to be barred from social relationships, men need an institution charged with the task of protecting their rights under an objective code of rules. This is the task of a government, of a proper government, its basic task, its only moral justification, and the reason why men do need a government. A government is the means of placing the retaliatory use of physical force under objective control, i.e., under objectively defined laws. All laws must be objective and objectively justifiable. Men must know clearly, and in advance of taking an action, what the law forbids them to do and why, what constitutes a crime, and what penalty they will incur if they commit it.
The morality by which action is judged is the same morality by which thought is judged. In this case, the morality that pertains to policing, to the judiciary, is the same morality that applies to the laws that are being enforced or interpreted by those police or by those judiciary. So let's relate this back to Rand's statement that government has a monopoly on the retaliatory use of force. When she's speaking of retaliatory use of force by the state and monopoly, she means that the government has a monopoly on thought concerning the use of force. They have a monopoly on the making of laws pursuant to which the police take action. You can't have action without law. You can't have law without action. You can't judge the two by differing moral systems. So the real question for anarchists is this. Do you really think it's logically inconsistent for Rand to imply that the government has a monopoly on lawmaking? If you think that's logically consistent, if you think that Rand is being logically consistent to say that the government has a monopoly on lawmaking, then it logically follows that it is not inconsistent with Rand's philosophy to argue that the government has a monopoly on the retaliatory use of physical force. In other words, that they have a monopoly on the use of police for the purposes of bringing people to justice after they have committed a wrong. In short, the anarchists have tried to deal with the issue of government monopoly by looking only at the physical side. They haven't looked at the mental side. They've looked at action without looking at thought. They've separated, the body from the mind. It's only when you understand that Rand was talking about government having a monopoly on not only the execution of laws, but the making of laws, that you can then discover that she was not being inconsistent at all when she said that the government have a monopoly on police forces that go out, round up people who have committed crimes, and bring them to justice, on justice systems that interpret those laws. Now some might say, okay, so much for anarchism, but what about minarchism? What about, the government makes the laws, but we could still have competitive police forces, and we could still have competitive judiciaries. Well, who pays for those things? That's where the conflict of interest comes in. Because either the victim or the accused would have to pay for the services rendered by the judge. You know, he'd have to be paid for his services. We couldn't expect him to work for free. He's not a slave. Same goes for the police. When we pool money, when everybody chips in, as it were, to a big pool that pays for the police and for the judiciary, and when there's only one pool of police and one pool of, you know, judicial officers, and they're all paid out of that same pot, they have no interest, the police or the judiciary, in favoring one person over another. There's no conflict of interest between them getting paid and justice being served. However, when there's the possibility that a police officer will no longer be paid by someone because in the past that police officer has taken action against that person, then we've got a conflict of interest. So let's say that the Smith family had a contract with a private police firm, and that the Smith's next door neighbors complained to that police firm that Smith had stolen some property or had, punched one of the neighbor's family. The police come and arrest Smith. Do you really think Smith's going to want to give that policing company the benefit of his money from then on? I don't think so. He's going to switch. He's going to go to another policing firm. Or maybe it doesn't occur at that level. Maybe the neighbor used their own police firm, and so Smith keeps paying for the other firm that he likes. But when they get to this private arbitration or this private judicial system, Smith's judge, the one he's paying, decides against Smith. Do you really think Smith in the future is going to want to be paying that judge anymore? I don't think so. So whether you're talking about a judge or a police officer, their own personal interest is in keeping Smith paying. They want to keep Smith as a customer. That means they're going to be very wary about making decisions that adversely affect Smith. When they're competing, they have to keep market share. And to the extent that they violate the interests of that market that they're serving, that portion that they've got as their market share, they lose that market share. It stands to reason. That's the reason why we don't bother even considering having private police forces and private judiciary. We cannot afford a justice system in which any consideration of how much money you might make in the future comes into play when deciding whether a person should be arrested or not, or whether they're guilty or not, or whether they should pay a fine or not, or whether they should have to pay compensation of some sort to someone else. It's a conflict of interest, and there's no way around it. So as I see it, the anarchist argument must fail, and even the minarchist argument about competitive policing and competitive judiciary must fail, but for different reasons. In that case, it's because of the conflict of interest that's inherent in having competitive systems. So there you go.